Mexia, Texas. The pencil shook in the hands of Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt, its point digging into the paper as if to anchor sanity. The words he wrote could have earned him solitary confinement, or worse, had they ever reached a German officer's eyes. "The Americans must be lying to us," he scrawled. "No nation could possess such abundance and still fight a global war." Through the narrow train window, he witnessed something that violated everything the Reich had taught him. The night was alive with light, not the feeble glow of kerosene or the flicker of candles, but the relentless blaze of industrial electricity. Every farmhouse, every intersection, every distant horizon burned with man-made daylight. In Germany, the night was absolute. Since 1940, blackout laws had smothered the homeland into silence and shadow. Even before the war, 4 out of 5 German farms still lived by lamplight. Yet here, across the Texas plains, light poured endlessly from a civilization that wasn't supposed to exist. The train hissed to a halt. 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps disembarked not from cattle cars, but from Pullman coaches lined with velvet seats and polished brass. There were no guards barking orders, no dogs, no barbed wire, only curious American faces watching the enemy arrive. For the townspeople of Mexia, it was spectacle. For the Germans, it was the first crack in a steel belief, the moment when ideology collided with infrastructure. What they could not yet comprehend was that this quiet arrival marked the beginning of the most complete psychological collapse of a military faith in modern history. The mathematics of victory had already shifted. It was no longer written in tank divisions or air squadrons, but in tonnage, voltage, horsepower, and speed of production numbers that no field commander could outfight. These men had believed that courage and discipline forged empires. In America, they would discover a civilization where organization was destiny, where strength was measured not by conquest, but by the capacity to produce without limit. When they stepped off that train in the warm Texas night, they believed they had merely lost a battle. By the time they left America, they would understand they had lost the future. For the officers of the German General Staff, war was not chaos, it was geometry. Every battle, every convoy, every regiment was an equation of precision and control. Victory belonged to those who could calculate faster than they could bleed. Since the lightning victories of 1939, the Wehrmacht had come to believe in a single law of civilization: efficiency equals destiny. In this belief lay both its genius and its blindness. From the factories of the Ruhr to the deserts of Africa, every German campaign was engineered on the same assumption that German organization, discipline, and mechanical superiority could outpace any opponent, regardless of scale. To the men of Rommel's Afrika Korps, this faith was almost religious. They had fought across the North African sands with engines that refused to quit, guns that hit at twice the effective range of the enemies, and supply lines that, at least on paper, could sustain the fury of blitzkrieg under any condition. They were not soldiers of improvisation, they were disciples of structure. The German model of war was not built for flexibility, but for perfection. Its supply system was designed to move with clockwork precision, fuel calculated to the litre, shells counted by the thousand, every convoy synchronized with the movement of divisions hundreds of kilometers away. The philosophy was brutally efficient: speed over stockpile, precision over redundancy. It worked until the equation met a variable it could not compute: abundance. The German industrial machine had reached its zenith between 1940 and 1942. In those years, 36 million workers fed the war economy. The factories of Krupp, Daimler-Benz, and Messerschmitt were temples of steel discipline, producing aircraft, tanks, and artillery at rates that no European rival could match. Yet, despite the aura of invincibility, the numbers hid a fatal weakness. Germany's entire wartime industrial output in 1942, roughly 11 million tons of steel, would be eclipsed by the United States within a single quarter the following year. But in 1943, the German soldier did not yet know this. He believed in the image painted by the Reich's propaganda: a decadent America, collapsing under its own capitalism, its factories idle, its workers soft, its people too divided to sustain a war of attrition. The speeches of Goebbels reinforced the illusion that the American giant was built of noise, not endurance, that their machines were crude, their men undisciplined, their women frivolous. The word Zivilisationsmüdigkeit, civilizational exhaustion, was whispered through the Wehrmacht like a mantra. To the German mind, industrial power was inseparable from moral rigor. They saw America's democracy as chaos masquerading as progress, a society that had traded hierarchy for weakness. Factories without discipline were useless. Abundance without ideology was decadence. And decadence, they believed, could never outlast purpose. That was the logic of confidence. In Berlin, Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments had become the brain of the war machine. Speer's engineers designed efficiency not only in machines, but in men. Every gesture, every minute, every bolt accounted for. Theirs was an economy of exhaustion disguised as triumph. Workers labored 16-hour shifts under slogans that promised salvation through production. Every German believed the same myth, that industrial willpower alone could compensate for limited resources. The idea was intoxicating a civilization so disciplined it could manufacture destiny from scarcity itself. And yet, the limits were already visible to those who could read the numbers. By the spring of 1943, German oil reserves had fallen below 50% of wartime requirements. Rubber and aluminum imports had collapsed. Coal, the black blood of industry, had to be rationed between tanks and trains. The Luftwaffe lost not only planes but fuel to fly them. The factories, though efficient, were suffocating. But for the men stepping off the train in Texas, that truth had not yet reached them. They still believed in the Reich's arithmetic that order could overcome abundance, that precision could defeat scale. They did not yet know that while Germany counted bullets, America counted factories. Back home, the propaganda machine concealed the industrial catastrophe behind cinematic illusions of superiority. Films showed the majestic lines of the Tiger tank, the engineering perfection of the Messerschmitt, the unstoppable march of German labor. But what they never showed were the empty rail cars, the idle furnaces, the men salvaging parts from wrecks because steel quotas had been cut again. The Reich was burning through its own veins, consuming its future to sustain its myth. Still, the soldiers believed. They believed in Ordnung, the sacred order of efficiency. They believed that industrial perfection was proof of cultural superiority, that no democracy could match the discipline of a command economy. Even defeat in Africa seemed temporary. "We are not beaten," wrote one lieutenant. "We are merely waiting for the Reich to unleash its full strength." But that strength no longer existed, not in the factories, not in the skies, not in the fuel reserves buried beneath the soil. What remained was belief, the last resource of an empire already running on ideology. When the trains left Norfolk and rolled deep into the American heartland, the German prisoners expected to see poverty-cracked roads, dark towns, broken machines. Instead, they saw power made visible. Each mile of track became a revelation. Endless electricity, mechanized farms, rail yards moving with automated precision. They had built their empire on scarcity made efficient. America had built hers on abundance made inevitable. And that difference invisible to them in 1943 would soon become the ideological fault line that shattered everything they thought they understood about civilization. What they didn't know was that the real American weapon had never been the rifle, the tank, or even the airplane. It was organization, a civilization calibrated for output, a machine built not for glory but for continuity. From the moment the first German prisoners boarded the Liberty ships in Algeria, that invisible system began to reveal itself one efficiency at a time. The ships themselves were proof of something that shouldn't exist. Each Liberty ship, assembled from 250,000 parts sourced from 32 states, had been built at a rate the Germans considered delusional. The SS Robert E. Peary had been launched in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Reich could not even unload its coal trains that quickly. To the German officers, this fact alone would have sounded like a lie, but the vessel they now stood on was one of 2,710 that America had produced in less than 3 years. The ocean voyage became a moving classroom in the anatomy of American power. The prisoners were fed as if they were guests, not captives. Real coffee, white bread, meat twice a day. They thought it was theatre, a psychological trick, but it wasn't. It was simply the standard. The sailors threw away more food daily than a German company had eaten in a week of desert warfare. They did not do it to humiliate. They did it because waste meant nothing in a nation where production never stopped. Every discarded crust of bread, every half-eaten steak was an unspoken statistic. In America, the margin of excess was the measure of strength. As the Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic, Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division watched in silence, noting every contradiction. The engines below deck ran so smooth they barely vibrated marine diesels that had been built in factories that did not exist 2 years earlier. The radar antenna turned above the bridge, sweeping the darkness with technology Germany believed was uniquely its own. Zimmermann's logbook recorded the moment with chilling precision. If a cargo ship carries radar, then the war is already lost. When the coastline of Virginia appeared through the morning haze, the myth of American weakness began to disintegrate. At Norfolk Naval Base, the horizon was machinery. Cranes, pipelines, locomotives, refineries, all moving in synchronization. In a single day, the port processed more tonnage than Hamburg could handle in a week. The prisoners stared in silence as they disembarked. One counted 47 ships loading simultaneously. The sea itself seemed domesticated, obedient to schedule. Then came the trains. Not the boxcars of European transport, but Pullman coaches with padded seats and dining service. The air was cold. The cars were air-conditioned, a luxury they had believed existed only in Hitler's private train. A sergeant even apologized that the cooling system wasn't working properly. In that single moment, a lifetime of propaganda collapsed. The journey south became a moving theater of industrial revelation. Each town they passed, Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, glowed with electricity deep into the night. Factories operated under full light at midnight. Gas stations remained open. Every household burned multiple bulbs. To men who had lived under blackout curtains for years, this was not comfort, it was heresy. Obergefreiter Hans Muir, whose father had been a Nazi bloc leader, wrote later, "They said America was collapsing. Yet even the smallest towns were brighter than all of Hamburg. At a rail yard in Roanoke, they watched as coal and water were loaded in half-an-hour operations that took German crews too. Machines replaced men. Power replaced muscle. The Americans had not conquered scarcity. They had eliminated it. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, once an electrical engineer at Siemens, estimated that the yard consumed more power in an hour than his entire district in Berlin in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left the lights burning in empty buildings. It was the carelessness of infinite supply. Through the windows, the prisoners saw the architecture of a civilization built on system logic, electric power as bloodstream, logistics as instinct, automation as reflex. It was not arrogance that shocked them. It was indifference. The Americans did not boast about their power. They simply used it. By the time the trains crossed into Tennessee, the desert soldiers of the Afrika Korps began to understand that they were traveling not through a country, but through an organism. Every town was a cell, every factory a lung, every rail line a vein pumping energy through the body of an empire built entirely on motion. It was not discipline that made this system work. It was scale married to organization, the one thing the German war machine could never replicate. The contradiction was no longer unseen. It was everywhere, in the electricity that burned without fear of air raids, in the food that was too plentiful to count, in the machines that replaced the need for men. The prisoners who had believed they were the elite of a superior civilization now watched from behind glass as another civilization, mechanical, impersonal, inexhaustible, revealed its true nature. For the first time, they felt not defeat, but irrelevance. The unseen system had become visible, and its light was blinding. America did not reveal itself through speeches or flags. It revealed itself through infrastructure, through the quiet precision of systems too vast to comprehend. When the trains carrying the German prisoners reached the heart of the continent, the landscape itself turned mechanical. power lines carved across the sky like veins of light, pipelines snaked through the soil, railroads split and rejoined in endless symmetry. It was not a nation improvising for war, it was a civilization that had mastered motion. At Norfolk Naval Base, they witnessed scale beyond imagination. The docks stretched for miles, cranes taller than cathedrals moved with the grace of clockwork, each rotation driven by silent electric motors. In a single day, that port handled more cargo than Hamburg could manage in a week. It was not the noise that terrified us, one engineer recalled later. It was the rhythm. Every machine moved as though it obeyed a single command. The Germans had built their faith on order. Here, they saw order perfected, stripped of ideology, and transformed into pure system. The Americans had made organization itself a weapon. The trains continued inland. They glided through the night with the smooth hum of diesel-electric power, carriages cooled by air conditioning, an absurd luxury in wartime. A sergeant apologized that the cooling unit wasn't working properly. To the prisoners, that apology felt more devastating than mockery. Comfort here was not weakness, it was proof of surplus. Through the windows, the world burned with light. Factories glowed at midnight. Street lamps lined every road. Gas stations remained open under electric halos. Every small town pulsed with the steady rhythm of energy. For men who had lived under blackout curtains for years, it was an act of heresy, a civilization unafraid to illuminate itself. Crossing Tennessee, they passed the Alcoa aluminum plant, a metallic leviathan stretching for miles along the river, its furnaces consuming more power than the entire city of Munich. Electricity became a visible force, transmuting ore into wings, energy into altitude. Further north, near Louisville, the rubber town complex rose from empty fields 4 synthetic rubber plants built in 18 months, producing 800,000 tons a year. Germany had invented the process, but had never reached even a fraction of that output. Each plant was more advanced than anything we had built, wrote Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, and there were 4 just here. They said there were dozens more. In that moment, I understood. We were the past. Near Detroit, the prisoners stared through the train windows as the horizon filled with steel and smoke. Willow Run Ford's bomber factory stretched beyond the visible world, a living monument of production. 42,000 workers, 1.5 million parts, 1,500 subcontractors, and a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. It was not an assembly line, it was the metronome of a civilization. Every worker a piston, every shift a heartbeat. Hauptmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot, wrote later, "We had been told their planes were crude and would fall apart in combat, but I saw precision born from abundance. They were not inferior, they were infinite." As the trains crossed the Midwest, the rhythm of the machine extended beyond the factories. Barges carried more grain on the Mississippi than Germany harvested in a year. Wheat fields rolled to the horizon, combed by machines that replaced entire battalions of laborers. In Kansas, grain elevators towered like temples, each one holding enough food to feed a city for months. "They move food the way we move ammunition," wrote a Bavarian prisoner. "Their waste could feed us for years." At the stockyards of Kansas City, tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The air itself smelled of industry. Workers ate meat sandwiches during their breaks, thick, casual, excessive. A guard bought 20 hamburgers for $1 and handed them out to the prisoners. They could not comprehend such carelessness. This was not indulgence. This was baseline. Then came the camps, not cages, but paradoxes. Camp Hearn in Texas had been built in 4 months. It housed nearly 5,000 prisoners in barracks wired with electricity, steam, heat, and hot water. The hospital inside had X-ray machines, surgical tables, and penicillin, the miracle drug the Reich could not produce. "They treated our infections with the medicine our generals could not afford," wrote Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division. In the kitchens, German chefs stood before walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, and gas ranges designed to feed thousands. One of them, Otto Krebs, wrote, We threw away more food in a single day than my family had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled, just excess. Each act of abundance became an ideological weapon. Each light bulb, each full plate, each hum of an unseen generator whispered the same truth. The war was no longer about courage, it was about civilization's capacity to organize. By late 1943, even the most fanatical among them began to sense the design behind the chaos. The United States was not an empire of orders and decrees. It was a self-sustaining organism. Energy moved like blood. Labor replaced command. The individual was a cog, but a willing one, powered not by obedience, but by opportunity. They saw women welding hulls, black workers operating cranes, teenagers running drills. In Germany, such sights would have been unthinkable. Here, they were ordinary. Efficiency had transcended ideology. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote the line that captured the heart of the revelation. We believed hierarchy created strength. In America, equality creates power. By the end of the year, they understood that the war had already been lost. Not in the deserts of Tunisia, nor in the skies of Europe, but in the factories, in the rail yards, and in the quiet hum of an electric civilization that had converted freedom into production. The German war machine had been built to conquer. The American one had been built to endure. And endurance, they now saw, was the ultimate weapon. By the winter of 1943, silence had begun to replace defiance inside the camps. The men who once spoke with certainty now wrote in fragments. Their letters home no longer carried slogans of faith, but questions that had no answers. The collapse had begun not in the factories, nor in the skies, but in the mind of the soldier. For months, they had watched an empire of abundance function effortlessly around them. The trucks that brought food to the camps arrived precisely on time. The power never failed. The trains moved without pause. Every process, from waste disposal to medical care, operated with an efficiency so casual that it became spiritual. It was not strength they feared anymore. It was the absence of struggle. In Germany, power had always been visible uniforms, banners, slogans. In America, it was invisible, embedded in circuits and systems, in rules that needed no speeches. The Reich had worshipped discipline. America worshipped continuity. And continuity was proving unstoppable. The most devoted believers were the first to fracture. Men who had marched under the desert sun, shouting oaths to the Führer, now sat in quiet disbelief, staring at the fluorescent lights above their bunks. They had been told that democracy was weak, that capitalism was chaos. Yet every day they saw that chaos produced more order than totalitarianism ever could. They began to realize that their defeat was not military, it was systemic. Oberleutnant Friedrich Radke, whose diary would later become a cornerstone of post-war study, described the moment plainly. I looked around and understood that we had built a world designed to break. The Americans had built one designed to last. Each encounter reinforced the fracture. When the prisoners were assigned to work in American factories and farms, they saw the full scale of what their ideology had denied them. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, machines processed more tomatoes in one day than German factories handled in a month, operated mostly by women and elderly men. Automation had replaced manpower. Intelligence had replaced hierarchy. At the River Rouge complex in Detroit, they saw a single industrial organism consuming iron, coal, and electricity, transforming raw matter into tanks and trucks without interruption. One German officer wrote later, "They worked like soldiers, but without command. They obeyed the rhythm of efficiency, not fear. What broke them was not humiliation, but admiration. The unbearable clarity that their enemy's strength came not from tyranny, but from structure born of freedom." The Special Projects Division of the U.S. Army, the secret office assigned to monitor prisoner psychology, began noting a phenomenon they called ideological collapse syndrome. The reports were clinical, almost detached. Prisoners no longer dispute production statistics. They have seen too much. Nazi rhetoric now appears to them as superstition. Inside the camps, the shift was visible. The camp newspapers, once filled with defiant nationalism, began publishing essays about democracy, economics, and the nature of power. Men who had sworn to die for the Reich now debated the merits of free markets. Some even asked for English textbooks, wanting to understand the language of the system that had conquered them without cruelty. The moral dissonance deepened after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian prisoners who cooperated with the Americans were given better rations, higher pay, and more freedom. The Germans watched their former allies working alongside American civilians, eating in cafes, even courting local women. "The Italians betrayed us," wrote Feldwebel Friedrich Schulz, "and yet they are treated with dignity. We treated them as inferiors. The Americans treat them as men. Democracy, which we were told to despise, behaves more honorably than our own Reich." That realization struck deeper than any bombing raid. It revealed a moral asymmetry the Germans could not compute, a victor who showed mercy. For soldiers raised to equate compassion with weakness, such humanity was unbearable. Then came Christmas. Across hundreds of camps, American churches and civic groups sent 500,000 gift packages to German prisoners, cigarettes, candy, games, even handwritten cards from children. At Camp Herne, the local Methodist choir performed carols in German. Women from the town sent homemade cakes. Boy Scouts delivered envelopes decorated with crayon stars. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know who we are, the enemy, and yet they show kindness that our own leaders reserve only for obedience. I have seen more Christianity in this enemy camp than in all the sermons of the Reich." The feast itself was obscene in its generosity: turkey, ham, potatoes, pies, ice cream, the abundance of a nation at war that still had enough to spare for its captives. A sergeant told them casually that every American family was eating the same meal that night. To men who had lived through rationing, that sentence was the final blow. "If they feed prisoners like this," one soldier murmured, "what must they feed their soldiers?" The collapse was complete. They no longer saw America as an enemy, but as an alternate future, the proof that another kind of civilization was possible. One built not on command, but on coordination, not on fear, but on faith in systems. By early 1944, the camps were no longer prisons of bodies, but laboratories of thought. The University of Chicago and Stanford sent professors to lecture. German physicists studied atomic theory beside Jewish refugees who taught them without bitterness. Movies were screened Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, stories of struggle and self-criticism that would have been banned in Germany. "They show their flaws to enemies," one lieutenant wrote. "They display their weakness and call it art. In Germany, such honesty would be death. Here, it is strength." That was the revelation. America's secret weapon was not steel, not oil, not money. It was the confidence to be imperfect, to expose its failures and grow stronger through them. A system so resilient that it could sustain both dissent and progress, inefficiency and abundance, chaos and order. By the time news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps in June 1944, the ideological war was over. The prisoners watched the newsreels in silence, the endless lines of ships, the floating harbours, the air armadas crossing the channel. They understood immediately what they were seeing. Not a battle, but the physical manifestation of system logic. "We had challenged a civilization," wrote Friedrich von Tauben, "that measured strength not by conquest, but by capacity. And now we saw what capacity truly meant. The collapse was not humiliation, it was revelation. The soldiers of the Reich had believed they were instruments of destiny. Now they understood that destiny belonged to those who could organize the future. When the war stripped away banners, uniforms, and belief, what remained was the machinery of civilization itself. The German prisoners had entered America expecting to find chaos, a land of noise, excess, and moral decay. What they found instead was the quiet hum of a system so vast and self-sustaining that it needed no ideology to command it. They began to see that industrial power was not merely a matter of machines, but of mindset, the alignment of human behavior with mechanical precision, not through fear, but through trust. It was the revelation that changed everything. Freedom could be engineered. In Germany, discipline had been external, imposed by rank, by hierarchy, by threat. In America, discipline was internal, produced by habit, by coordination, by the invisible structure of systems. The Reich demanded obedience. America demanded participation. And participation, they now realized, was the higher form of control. For centuries, Europeans had believed that order required authority, that civilization could only function when men were commanded. But here was proof of the opposite, a civilization organized by voluntary synchronization, by individuals cooperating through shared logic rather than shared fear. To the Germans, this was heresy. To the Americans, it was simply Tuesday. They began to understand that America's industrial miracle was not an accident of resources, but the expression of a deeper philosophy that power, when distributed, multiplies. Every worker in a factory, every farmer in a field, every student in a classroom was a gear turning in the same machine, not because they were ordered to, but because the system made it natural. This was the essence of the New World, a society that could manufacture abundance without central command, that could organize complexity without terror. It was a democracy of production, where freedom did not weaken the machine, it fueled it. From the desert officers of the Afrika Korps to the engineers of IG Farben, the lesson spread slowly, painfully. They had believed that total control created efficiency. Now they saw that efficiency, born of coercion, collapses under its own weight. In a free system, mistakes are corrected by movement. In a totalitarian one, mistakes are repeated by order. The Americans had built a civilization that could fail safely, and therefore could never truly die. In post-war interviews, many prisoners described a single haunting realization: that the war itself had been a test, not of courage, but of civilizational architecture. Germany's model was vertical power flowing from the top down, precision achieved through obedience. America's model was horizontal power distributed across millions, precision achieved through scale. The former was fragile, the latter infinite. War, wrote Friedrich Radke, was no longer about courage, but about civilization's capacity to organize. That sentence would later be quoted in universities across Europe, taught as one of the simplest yet most devastating truths of the modern age. For the prisoners, it was not theory, it was experience. They had lived inside the organism and felt its pulse. What they discovered was not merely that America had more machines, but that America itself was a machine, a social engine, converting freedom into power, diversity into resilience, imperfection into strength. And it functioned because every part, from the smallest to the largest, was allowed to move. To the German mind, this was the true miracle, that a society with no central voice could still act in harmony, that chaos could outperform command, that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. When the prisoners read American newspapers, they were stunned by what they found: criticism, debate, even protest. Yet the system did not collapse. It absorbed dissent like a circuit absorbs current, redirecting it into momentum. That was when they realized that the greatest stability comes not from silence, but from noise perfectly managed. The machine of American civilization did not crush individuality, it harnessed it. Its parts did not obey, they aligned. That was the difference between a nation that could fight forever and one that was destined to burn out. As months passed, this understanding turned into a quiet respect. Even those who still despised the enemy began to speak differently. They no longer called it the American illusion. They called it the American method. A few used a more dangerous word: the future. For them, the war was over long before Germany surrendered. They had seen what their own leaders could never understand, that a civilization's true weapon is not its army, but its ability to create systems that survive without them. That insight would outlive the camps, the war, and even the century that birthed it. The men who had once sworn loyalty to tyranny would return home carrying a new blueprint in their minds, the architecture of an open, industrial civilization. And in time, that blueprint would rebuild a nation from its ruins. Because the ultimate lesson of their captivity was this: a society that can turn organization into empathy, production into purpose, and freedom into order, will always prevail over one that turns obedience into silence. The Reich had built machines of war. America had built a civilization that manufactured peace. The war ended, but the hum did not. Even as the smoke cleared over Europe and the ruins of the Reich collapsed into silence, the rhythm of American industry continued steady, tireless, unbroken. To the men who returned home from captivity, that sound became a memory too vast to forget. They had arrived in America as soldiers of an empire that worshipped order. They left as witnesses to a civilization that had transformed order into motion. In the months after surrender, the repatriation trains rolled eastward. 371,000 prisoners crossed the Atlantic again. The same ocean that had carried them to defeat now carried them toward reconstruction. They stepped onto German soil not as conquerors, not even as survivors, but as men who had seen another kind of future. Many found their homes burned, their cities hollowed out, their families lost. Yet among them was a strange calm. They had seen what civilization could look like when it refused to die. They had seen abundance without cruelty, discipline without tyranny, and power without arrogance. Letters from former prisoners began to circulate across post-war Germany, quiet, handwritten manifestos of industrial rebirth. They spoke of organization without oppression, of systems that served people rather than consumed them. Some entered politics, some rebuilt factories, some simply taught their children the new logic they had learned behind barbed wire. "We learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest," wrote Hans Kroll, later ambassador to the United States. "That democracy creates wealth, that diversity breeds strength, that dignity is not weakness but the foundation of power." Those lessons would become the blueprint for West Germany's resurrection, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The men who had once served tyranny rebuilt their homeland with the logic of liberty. Their weapons became machines. Their battalions became production lines. They had brought home the industrial philosophy of their captors, and with it, the seeds of democracy. Historians would later call it the most successful re-education in modern history. But it had not been achieved through propaganda, nor through force. It had been achieved through reality. Every meal, every light, every act of mercy had been a lesson in what civilization truly meant. America had not converted them through ideology, but through observation, through the sheer undeniability of a system that worked. 4 decades later, in 1985, hundreds of former prisoners returned to America for a reunion in Texas. They stood on the same soil where their transformation had begun, surrounded now by American friends, their children grown, their accents softened by time. Former Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Meir, once a tank mechanic in Tunisia, spoke quietly before the crowd. "We came to America as enemies. We left as students." Then Oberst Hermann Gutz, 78 years old, delivered the final words, the epilogue, not of a war, but of an awakening. "America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from cooperation, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We who came as believers in a lie left as witnesses to the truth. You defeated us not with bombs, but with light." Applause filled the hall, rising like the sound of a machine restarting after years of silence. It was not triumph, but recognition, the resonance between two civilizations that had once tried to destroy each other, and instead had rebuilt the modern world together. Outside, the evening was warm. The streets of Texas glowed with the same light that had once stunned the prisoners 4 decades earlier, steady, indifferent, infinite. To them, it no longer symbolized defeat. It symbolized continuity, the enduring pulse of a civilization that had turned electricity into ethics. As the night deepened, the hum of distant factories merged with the wind, the same sound that had followed them across oceans and generations. It was the echo of the machine, the sound of a world that had learned to organize itself, not through fear, but through creation. And somewhere in that sound was the final truth of the industrial age. They were not defeated by weapons, nor by armies, nor even by ideology. They were defeated by a civilization that understood how to build and how to endure.